Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the CEO of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace, with us from now until just before midnight. And very welcome to both of you. Front pages then, let us kick off with the Daily Express, leading with the evidence given to the COVID inquiry today by Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain, with the headline, Revealed Orgy of Narcissism at the Heart of COVID Failings. The eye focuses on comments made privately by Mr Johnson, but revealed today that old people should have just accepted their fate when the virus struck so that young people could survive. Those remarks by the then Prime Minister also leading tomorrow's Times. The Daily Star depicts Boris Johnson as a clown and apologises for calling his government useless and moronic, when in fact they've now been shown to be much worse. Meanwhile, after Mr Cummings repeatedly used the C word in his evidence today, the Telegraph says counsel at the inquiry accused him of feeding a toxic culture of misogyny in Number 10. Daily Mail's verdict, Mr Cummings has been left squirming after poisoning the response to COVID with toxic briefings against his colleagues. Meanwhile, the Israeli airstrike, which has killed a number of people in a Gaza refugee camp, is the top story for The Guardian. The Sun pictures a British police officer taking down posters of Israeli children held hostage by Hamas and asks, "How dare you?" Rail ticket Q-turn is how the Metro describes the decision not to close hundreds of railway ticket offices after a public outcry against the move. The Financial Times leading with the closure of city firm Odey Asset Management 5 months after its founder, Crispin Odey, was accused of sexual assault and harassment. A reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of those papers while you watch us and listen to our guests. So let's head to Sonia and to Mark. Welcome to both of you. So the COVID inquiry, two star turns today, Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain in his role in communications. But again, it's the comments made by Boris Johnson that are making the front pages today, Sonia.
Absolutely. And there were two important things that came out today. The first is some of what Boris Johnson was thinking, and then the second stuff is all about the culture of Number 10. And I think the most important substantive issue is what was going on in terms of conversations behind the scenes around lockdowns and when it was right to lock down and when it was right to impose social restrictions. And one of the key things that we've learned, and this comes from an extract from Patrick Vallance's diaries, the government's chief scientific advisor during the pandemic, is that so we had the kind of lockdown, the initial social restrictions in March. Then obviously it looked like COVID was going up again, and we had a whole set of new conversations about lockdowns in autumn, November, December 2020. And what it turns out was that Boris Johnson was still privately saying, well, you know, some of these people who are going to get ill and die, they're old anyway. So maybe we should just, you know, they should take one for the team so young people can go about their business. He was still making those arguments. Now, on one level, it's not a surprise because we saw government policy at that time. And I think it's easier to be more forgiving of a government making mistakes in March when there was so much uncertainty to them literally making the same mistakes again in the autumn. Because one of the things we know about a virus that spreads exponentially is the longer you leave it to impose social restrictions, the tougher and those social restrictions need to be and the longer they need to be in place for. So lots of experts think that the fact that Boris Johnson left it so late in the autumn was one of the reasons why schools had to close again for a second time. In my view, a completely unforgivable consequence. So I think people will be... It's hard, isn't it? Because we know so much. There's been so much reporting about what was reportedly going on behind the scenes. And, you know, the fact that Boris Johnson used to swing about and change his mind such that Dominic Cummings used to call him a trolley, and that was a running joke. A shopping trolley, that was a running joke in Number 10. It was like a shopping trolley careering down the aisle. So some of this isn't surprising, but it still should kind of shock us in some ways that we knew what we were dealing with, the virus, by the time it came to autumn, winter 2020, and Boris Johnson was still saying, well, old people, they're kind of expendable, whereas actually there was a real issue, there was going to be a real issue around pressure on the NHS. There was no way the government was not going to lock down at some point, and it would have been much better to do it more quickly when the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer were saying we should be locking down now.
But even in March, we heard the possible reasons why it was so late. You know, they were distracted by just coming into office, for example. Boris Johnson had just won an election. They just got Brexit done, to put it in its commas. You know, there was 5G issues and all this sort of stuff. But they were really late because they were holding on to Plan A, which was to have one big curve, which is get herd immunity, and then not get the big one in the winter, which was one of the predictions. And they held on to this idea of herd immunity too late, in Dominic Cummings' view, as we heard.
Well, that's the interesting thing. When you say they held on to this too late, what this comes down to is the Prime Minister held on to this too late. And, you know, the old maxim that advisers advise and ministers decide is one of the things that really comes out in this. There'll be a lot of people out there tonight and around the country reading this kind of news who, for a variety of reasons, don't like Dominic Cummings. And for understandable reasons, they associate him pretty centrally with the Boris Johnson project and the government and various things that went wrong with it. But one thing about the interesting inside story of this, when you see these messages, you see what Cummings is sending to Lee Cain. There's messages when he's messaging him saying, get in here now. Here being the room where he's sitting with Boris, where he says, I've said it seven, 8 times, and he just doesn't get it. He's going on about the mayor in Jaws nonsense again. You need to get in here and drag him back onto the topic. And Dominic Cummings, like him or loathe him, was absolutely doing his nut in there because for one of the reasons he dislikes politics and politicians is he's basically an evidence-led person. And he's iconoclastic, he doesn't play nicely with others and all those things that we know about him. But he was quite early looking at this, saying, this is really serious. We need to take this really seriously.
NHS data in.
I mean, he was right.
Not the same as the Sage modelling.
And you know, he was messaging him at that point saying, we're talking about 100,000 to 500,000 dead. For context, the Spanish influenza in 1918 was 250,000. You know, he was out early on that, and he was doing his nut because the shopping trolley was, in his view, reciting whatever he'd heard most recently. And they couldn't drag him onto that topic. And you know, the advising was happening and the deciding evidently wasn't.
I mean, it is absolutely fascinating unpicking it. What does it tell us about the dysfunctionality at the heart of government, or even those comments that Daily Telegraph has picked up, the accusation that he fed this toxic, you know, misogynistic culture in Number 10? Or is he allowed to sort of, you know, the sense that they're all tearing their hair out trying to deal with Boris Johnson here?
Well, of course there was some of that, but I think it's just the language that a lot of people will find shocking. You know, the C word, as you said, some other really choice phrases that were all over these WhatsApps with, you know, colleagues, very senior colleagues responsible for advising politicians at the highest level who were exchanging these terms in messages with each other. And I don't know about you guys, but that's not how I communicate with people that I have a professional relationship with. You know, friends is one thing, but people that you've got professional relationships with. And it's quite extraordinary in some ways because it didn't occur to them that at some point these WhatsApp messages might be looked at by an inquiry. So we're literally seeing the frankest of exchanges between these people. But of course, it's kind of worrying to think that these were the cultures, this sort of language being traded, blows traded across Number 10 with people who disagreed with each other. That does not project an image of a calm Number 10 that is making decisions, that is led by a Prime Minister who's looking at the evidence, who's sort of taking decisions. And, you know, I think, again, people may not be... We know enough about Cummings now and, you know, we've seen him give evidence to committees. You know, it's maybe not that surprising, the stuff that's come out, but it's still, again, you know, it does not speak well of Number 10.
Daily Express as well revealed the orgy of narcissism at the heart of COVID failings. Oh, that's The Guardian. Well, we'll swap it over in just a moment. But we had Lee Cain, didn't we, you know, in charge of comms at the time, suggesting that this was the wrong crisis for that Prime Minister. And, you know, the Baroness in charge said, please speak plainly. I think we all got what she meant. But the point was, at that point, you needed someone who is going to be decisive and, you know, effectively future-proof the nation, and Boris Johnson was not that. When he got the job, everyone said he was going to be like a chairman and not chief executive because they knew possibly he's not a details man. do we fundamentally expose Boris Johnson in this? And does it mean he can never really come back to the heart of politics and government, do you think, from this?
A few things in there. Firstly, orgy of narcissism at the heart is interesting because it's Boris Johnson's words that he sent to Dominic Cummings later that year saying, all this leaking against me and Carrie and so on is an orgy of narcissism. And the inquiry said to Cummings, do you agree there was an orgy of narcissism? And he said, in government, yes. As in straight back on Boris. But what people said about him being a chairman was, firstly, their hope. Boris Johnson was, in the view of the Conservative Party, necessary in alliance with Dominic Cummings, despite their known downsides, in order to get an election, win an election. And that worked. But there were a hell of a lot of downsides, which people knew about beforehand in a lot of cases. When you then look at what that meant in government, people thought, well, let's hope he's a chairman. And they also thought about when he was Mayor of London, where some of the elements of that did work, not all of it did, but some of the elements that did work best were where he did devolve power and
delegate
to good people who came onto his team. That did not happen in Boris Johnson's Downing Street. You kept hearing all this for literally months and then years. Well, when's he start going to get the right advice and so on? Well, once you're onto 3-4 different teams of special advisors in Downing Street, the issue isn't just the advice that's being said, it's the ear that it's going into and whether it's going straight out the other one or not.
And fundamentally, the failure to believe in lockdown as a mechanism. The mitigation was fine, wash your hands, all that sort of stuff was fine. But lockdown, he probably fundamentally did not believe in.
And I think that's what
the right wing does not, does it? I mean, you see in the papers, on the papers now.
When Lee Kane said, this wasn't the right Prime Minister for that kind of crisis, I think, yes, there's a bit of soft soaping going on there. But interestingly, there were some crises, Ukraine, for example, where actually the way in which Boris Johnson approached that specific thing did genuinely play to his strengths. He did set the tone. He did take advice, listen to it, and take concrete action in a way that pushed America and all of allies in the right direction. Does that mitigate for this? Absolutely not. But there's an argument to say that, to go to your original question of, does it mean he can't come back? I mean, this is... When people are talking about the idea of him coming back, it's absolute wishful thinking because this is what we know now, so far, on this massive issue. We will learn yet more. He himself is going to give evidence. There's more. And, of course, had he not left office when he did, he would have found himself sitting in government with no ministers willing to serve with him. And those are concrete things you can't get around.
OK, fascinating. There's the Express here. Let's just see the Guardian as well, shall we, if we can? There we go. Number 10's toxic culture laid bare at the COVID inquiry. Remember, this was only a few months into them taking office as well. And actually, some of these people did not survive the year. Absolutely fascinating to witness it. But, final thought from you, Sonia. This is supposed to be lessons learned. We go back to, by mid-Jan, we were watching videos of people collapsing in streets in China. By mid-Feb, I'd already bought my toilet rolls. What were they doing? What were they doing that it took so long?
Well, I think it's a really good question. And I think what you said earlier sort of hinted at it, which is that he didn't want to think that a lockdown might be necessary, social restrictions might be necessary, because it tugs ideologically against him as a politician. Like, he sees himself as, as a very liberal. He doesn't like sort of interfering in people's lives. Unfortunately, it's where the evidence was pointing. And I do think that you can be... For me, the most unforgivable thing was they made a mistake in March, and it did cost lives, I think. But the most unforgivable thing is that they made that mistake twice and a third time.
OK, fascinating. As you say, we will hear from Boris Johnson at that inquiry and indeed the current Prime Minister as well. So more to come on that and more to come on this programme. Back in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, the chief leader writer of The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and the CEO of Total Politics Group, Mark Wallace. Welcome back to both of you. Let's just take a look at The Guardian, shall we? A picture there of the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza, graveyard for children, they say, as airstrikes killed dozens at this refugee camp. But domestic matters is the stories that you've picked out, including The Sun, Mark, with the headline, "How dare you?" Tell us more.
Yeah, so these are posters that quite a lot of people will have seen these images online. Quite a lot of people will have seen them, watching tonight, will have seen them in their local areas and town centres, which have a very simple demand. They highlight a picture of one or more of the hostages women, children, old people, other civilians being held by Hamas since the 7th of October, and they demand for them to be released. I think a fair-minded, reasonable, decent person could not find something offensive about this. And there's now footage that's been going around on social media of a variety of people tearing these things down, disgustingly.
Sometimes young people doing it.
Sometimes, but also that there have been some disgusting examples of some of them being graffitied with kidnapped Jewish children with Hitler moustaches drawn on them and so on, some obscene reactions. But then to see officers of the Metropolitan Police tearing down posters like this, I think is even more obscene. Personally, I'm so appalled by this side. I printed some of these posters off and went around my local area and stuck them up where I live. But to see the police doing this, when, frankly, we've seen chants on London...
For what purpose, sorry? Why are they taking...
Well, the Metropolitan Police put out a very mealy-mouthed, very lengthy statement saying this was about trying to avoid the inflaming community relations. But, frankly, if someone's inflamed by a simple demand to release innocent children, the problem is with them. When there's people chanting support for Hamas or chanting from the river to the sea on London streets and the police stand and let them march by and do it and don't interrupt, and then they're willing to act against a poster like this, it's appalling. It sends a horrendous message.
And Sonia, I know you want to talk about Keir Starmer, his comments today about a ceasefire or not. It's on the front page of The Times. We will have to talk about that next time. I do apologise, we've run out of time. But the headline is Starmer threatens shadow ministers who call for a Gaza ceasefire. We've already seen it with one MP, haven't we?